Hello, I'm Anthony Romrell. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these principles of design. We're talking about placement and division. So the first principle we're going to discuss we're going to cover is point of interest. Now you can see here I have 4 examples of point of interest, and this is single point. This and these 2 are multi-point. You can see this is very static. There's nothing dynamic about it. It's centered, but it does draw your interest into the center of the page, which can be helpful, but as I said before, it's not necessarily interesting. Where this example here moves the point of interest to the right of the thumbnail here, and it creates the concept of movement. It creates the idea of unequal spacing. You can see that the spacing between here and this point and this point are different, which makes it dynamic. When you do multiple points, even though they're the same size, they're also dynamic because of their uneven spacing between it and the ends of the paper, and also it creates a line between the 2 points. And here is a 4th example of a dynamic view of point of interest. Next, I want to talk about unequal spacing. In this example here, we have even spacing between the page breaks. So this paper here is cut into fourths evenly along both horizontal and vertical axes. And we have other examples which create visual interest in the page when we have unequal spacing. We have a large space here versus this smaller space. And again, the difference between the two, there's a lot more dynamic nature behind this one versus the static nature of this one. It's generally a good idea not to center things, although there can be good reasons for it. But this, again, creates a sense of hierarchy and a sense of engagement. And here's 2 more examples. This one is a slight variation on here. And this one we have the 4 pane again, however, rather than the 4 equal spacing on the in this example, we have 4 panes, which are quite different. And when you're creating it, there's not necessarily a right way, but these are 4 examples of alternative ways to creating visual interest using unequal spacing. In this next example, we have a term called visual agreement. Now, visual agreement, I'm going to define it as you're thinking as to how you're using your spacing in an agreeable way or similar ways. So, in this case, I just have 3 lines which create equal spacing, and it's not dynamic. However, it does create visual agreement in that we have the same type of shape and the same type of line work between them. We also have visual agreement, even though we have some staggered examples here. We have visual agreement in that the spacing here and also the spacing here and here are all the same. So even though we are dynamic, we have spaced this bit of the page here. We've used unequal spacing with the page. We have a section here which is unequal to this section. We do have visual agreement. Here is another example. We've actually cut the page. If you were to draw an imaginary line here, we have unequal spacing in the page, but we do have visual agreement not only in the items we're using, the components, but in the spacing between the components. And here's a 3rd example of visual agreement, not only between the spacing, but the shapes themselves. And then a bit of unequal spacing used here, which could also be considered, this could be considered a point of interest in this group, and this could be considered a point of interest. This is also a point of interest, but this would be multi-point of interest using visual agreement. You could call this also multiple points of interest using visual agreement. Now we're using a line here. Now if you notice between in these top two examples, we've added a line to group these elements together. However, we have equal spacing. This line here represents an equal portion for each page. Same with this one. This represents equal spacing. Even though we have unequal spacing on different parts of the layout, we are breaking the page directly in half with this line. It's a little bit better if we don't break the page. We use the dynamic or unequal spacing to along with this line placement to create visual interest and still tie together the elements. You see we're using this line to tie these elements together and this element. We have the same issue here. We're no longer equally equally dividing the page, but we are creating visual interest and using this line to connect everything together. You'll notice these are aligned. In this principle here, we're going to talk about the horizon line. You'll notice in these two examples, the horizon line in this one is exactly centered, and there's no emphasis between the ground and the sky. However, in this example, the horizon line is lowered to the ground, and in the cityscape, we have emphasis on something, and that is the sky. You could also have emphasis on the ground, or depending on where you place the horizon line, change your emphasis. Now in static placement, we have a single point of interest and a double point of interest. Both are static in that they are exactly centered within the page, and it creates no sense of movement. If you'd like it to stop, and if this is the feeling you're looking for, then it's a decent design. Same with this example. It's a multi-point of interest. However, because they are centered within the page here, if you can see the invisible lines, because they are centered in the page, there's no movement. In this example of dynamic spacing, however, there is movement. You could imply that this one is falling because of the level of space here, the amount of space between this section of it and this section, and that these two are falling and will hit the ground because of the closeness of the end of the page here as compared to this. The last thing I'd like to talk about is the golden section. Now the golden section means that things are divided up in an uneven way using even elements. So you can see we have our ratios, and each time you use one of these small squares to create the golden section, you double it up. And so this particular element is twice the size of this. This element adds the scale. Still use the ratio of being equal in all of these, but we add the next two sections. So we've added 2 and 2, and then 3 and 3, and now 5 and 5, which is equal to 1, 2, and 1, 2, 3, if you count this size, and on up. And this creates a visual interest that is considered to be the prime of how spacing works and the best way to space a layout. Now remember to follow your book and instruction for more concepts behind design.